Are AI robots going to kill us all? Will AI become all-powerful? Will humanity eventually get trapped into the matrix while AI harvests our bodies? These are fun questions, but maybe they're actually the wrong kinds of questions to be asking about AI. And these questions, in fact, might be part of the problem. What if I told you there were sneakier, more important risks of AI? This question and more will be explored on this episode of AI Curious through an in-depth conversation with Sara Watson, one of the world's leading technology critics. Welcome to AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. There is much about AI I'm excited about, yes, but there are tons of concerns. So I want to include more AI critiques on this show, and that brings us to today's guest, Sara Watson, one of the world's most thoughtful, insightful, and incisive technology critics. Sara has been an industry analyst for Forrester, basically the gold standard of industry research, and her writing appears in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Wired, and on and on. She jokes that she's a Cassandra, as in the ancient Greek Cassandra, who had the power of prediction, and that she was prescient about tech concerns like data privacy way before it was cool. You can argue that her writing about data privacy helped educate the public about the issue. In 2016, she wrote an in-depth piece for the Columbian Journalism Review called Towards a Constructive Technology Criticism that still holds up today, that is still very relevant today, and there's a link to it in the show notes, where essentially she makes the case that criticism is not the same thing as negativity, and it's certainly not the same thing as nihilism. I think that's an important point. As AI gets hypier and hypier, there are some that want to ignore the critics or assume they're just doomers who want to slow down the progress. I think that's a mistake. I think that thoughtful criticism is part of progress. Although, as Sara asks in our conversation, progress for who? And as for Sara's thoughts on AI, is it good? Is it bad? That's complicated, just like AI. The subject is not black and white. And I love that this conversation gets into the nuance of AI concerns without any kind of good, bad, false dichotomy. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Sara Watson, technology critic. Sara, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to see you, and thank you for having me.
So excited to chat with you. One reason I am so excited is your nuanced take on tech and AI critiques. I love that you don't really come from a school of thought that like AI is good or AI is bad. There's a spectrum. There's context when it's clearly useful, and there's context when it's clearly problematic. So with that kind of backdrop, if you will allow the spectrum framework, how would you characterize kind of where you are on that continuum? And then we'll get into and unpack some of the AI concerns that you have.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I love that framing right off the bat because I've always been interested in the idea that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And so that has always been my starting point for talking about any technology. And I think AI lends itself very well to that framing. For me, where I stand right now is cautiously optimistic is a good way of describing my stance.
Same.
I think as a former analyst at Gartner and both Forrester and Gartner, I think we are deep in the hype cycle. And so unsurprisingly, that clouds a lot of judgment. It shapes the conversation a lot. And so I think that's exactly the moment in which tech criticism needs to do a lot of careful work. And frankly, tech journalism needs to start doing a lot more investigative work, kind of foundational work to sift through the hype. I think that is always a tricky moment because there's this growing demand for information, but there's also this kind of tension of what can we believe? How much time and energy do we have to really investigate the claims of any given technology platform, VC, whoever is pushing these narratives. And it's only to say that's the most important kind of moment to be careful and critical and systematic about how we think about these things.
That's a great point. The irony is, at this most critical moment where criticism is most needed, there's probably a potential for you to also be the least wanted voice in the room. After the party's in full swing, hey, AI can solve all these problems. And when the critic raises their hand and, well, let's think about X, Y, Z, it can come off as overly negative. And as we'll get into deeper in the conversation, that's being critical is not the same thing as being negative and nihilistic. But it's important to raise concerns while also still appreciating the positive. So with that context, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that criticism can do is to help us ask the right questions or make sure that we're framing things in the right light or the right kind of metaphorical structures to think through how this is actually working. And so for me, the core question when it gets to like, am I positive, negative? Am I optimistic? Am I nihilistic? I think it comes back to a question of what is it actually good for?
Yeah.
And what should it be used for, right? I think that we get into a space of normative questions. And I think that is also where criticism can help us walk through the kind of social dynamics, the kind of political, economic, et cetera, framings for how to answer that should question. Because I think a lot of tech gets driven by, we can, so we should, and we will.
Yeah. So with that important context as a backdrop, let's get into some of your key concerns at the moment, and then perhaps how they've evolved in the past couple of years as the hype train is in full speed. Yeah, jump ball to you. What are your top AI concerns as of now? And then we can get into more details and unpack them a bit.
Sure. So I did a little bit of a rundown just to have them right off the top of my head here. But I think before we jump into it, I think it's worth talking about the differences of timescales of concerns. Sure. And so I think there's a huge discrepancy between folks who are talking about very long-term existential risk, the
doomers, the
doomers, right?
Doomers, yes.
But you look at who they are, and they're largely white men in tech, making these like very long scale arguments. And then there's a whole slew of critiques that are a little bit more grounded in the present harms that are already happening. And so we start to see those conversations coming from largely academic scholars, people with social science backgrounds who have been looking at the context of AI in these larger systemic ways that technology has always shaped society, and that AI is just an extension of these concerns that we have about how power structures are implemented and deployed. And these conversations tend to focus more on things like historical bias in data sets, disparate impacts on different populations and how they're affected by algorithmic decision-making tools. Folks like Kathy O'Neill and Tin Gebru. We have questions, obviously, that are pushed in the media about concerns about job displacement. And that's this fear-mongery, like robots are going to take our jobs, AI is going to take our jobs. And I think that taps into a very clear sense of anxiety and kind of precarity of the potential readers' concerns about these things. We also have arguments about surveillance and privacy as an extension of the data, kind of big data arguments about we started with these questions about companies collecting all of this data on us. And it turns out they're using the data towards these ends and feeding into all of these models and training data sets, et cetera.
What are the concerns you think not enough people are thinking about? And especially, let's think, you mentioned the hype cycle. I'm guessing a lot of listeners of this podcast fall on the pretty freaking excited about AI camp. And I'm to a large degree in that camp myself with reservations, right? What should myself and other listeners who are like generally AI bullish, what should we be thinking more about? What are questions we should be asking more regularly interrogating AI development, interrogating who's building this, and thinking more critically about the state of play and where it's going?
Yeah. So there's two that come to mind that are really only just scratching the surface of where kind of coverage has landed so far. And I think it's partly because they're difficult questions to investigate. And so one is the environmental costs of AI, the sheer computational toll of running these large language models and embedding this into things like search and having this comparative analysis of actual impact on water supply, on data center power. The list goes on, that it's so easy to forget that there is a material cost to AI and to technology generally. It's very easy to ignore the fact that cobalt mining in the Congo is impacted in your latest iPhone update. And that environmental connection is really important. I think that has been underreported just by lack of access. And I think that's a huge area for further investigation. And also just don't take for granted the fact that there is a material cost to this. And then I think the other one is, frankly, the concentration of power. And I think there have been a few people arguing for this or arguing that this is really a core concern. But if you look at the fact that even if we're talking about open models, we're still approaching this with the idea that you are building a lot of other technology on top of this model. So there is a kind of precarity of the stack being built on even if it's a not proprietary model, that it's still a singular point of failure. And I don't know, just looking back at the Microsoft CrowdStrike, like Delta fiasco, like it was just such a clear indication of how fragile complex systems are when there are these like single points of failure that are shared by so many different legacy infrastructure systems. And so what is the legacy system that we're building on top of AI, right? So many enterprise organizations are still running COBOL, and there aren't even people being trained in COBOL anymore. Marriott, their entire reservation system still runs on that.
Wow.
Having a sense of history and a sense of the reality of just how embedded these systems become, when obviously we're seeing how much they're changing every single month with a new update or a new generation, and how much fragility is baked into a system that is essentially using this very volatile starting point.
There are a couple of topics you touched upon earlier I'd love to dig a bit deeper on. One is bias and how often the teams developing AI don't come from the same communities that the AI could be impacted. To be more blunt, often wealthy white men in Silicon Valley. And we know an example of facial recognition software, for example, that's a very concrete example where because the people training this data and because the data going into it was organized a certain way and had a cross-section of society in a certain way, the end result was this facial recognition software was far worse at identifying people of color, which has real world consequences when the police are using it to apprehend suspects. That's one very concrete example. Let's talk a little more about how bias can be an issue with AI and other concerns that you and others have about AI development when it comes to doing it in an ethical, transparent, and as bias-free way as possible.
I think it comes down to a fundamental question of the nature of training data sets, right? The fact that you have to work from historical material and the fact that history is biased. And, we're just reifying these systems that are unjust to begin with and perpetuating them further. And so I think one of the biggest critiques that I have seen and I appreciate is that we are foreclosing future justice by baking in the systemic bias of the past. And that's a really fundamental epistemological problem with AI is that that is how you build it, right? Like based on prior knowledge. And so what space is there for future exploration, future alternative structures, future openness when you have to be building on a predictive model that is based on the past?
Or if I could take a stab at putting it differently, if we are trying to be, quote, truthful in the way we build AI models to represent the world, and that truth includes all the awful and deeply problematic systemic biases that exist, yes, you might get a gold star for truthfulness. But when we then apply that model to create future solutions, it's effectively bringing our sins of bias and systemic problems in the past and implanting them on the future, thus perpetuating these problems and inequities. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And I think I would even push back a little bit on the idea of truth, right? Like the idea that data is objective is, I think a lot of engineers make that assumption and make that kind of starting point of it's the data's there, it is a representation of reality, when in fact people are making decisions about what is captured, how the data is structured, what were the options in the form, right? And so none of these things are without human influence. And I think it's so easy to, when we're talking about technology, to forget that humans are behind every single choice. And so even a lot of people tend to say algorithms are just math, right? It's objective. And it's no, you're choosing which algorithm to apply. And so even that is rife with a lot of assumptions about worldviews, about epistemologies, about how people think, what they're optimizing for. And so I think one of the core questions I always ask as a critic specifically of technology, is to ask, what are we optimizing for? Because I think it's a question that speaks to engineers, but also forces people to talk and examine their values. Because if you're being explicit about, well, we're optimizing for time on site, actually you're optimizing for the business model, right? Is implicit in this kind of larger ecosystem of growth and not of providing user value.
That's more than, to your point, that's more than just math. That's values. You're imposing a value in that. That's not, it's the algorithm. No, there's a value there. Let's talk a bit about misinformation and deepfakes. Personally, that's one of the things that most concern me about AI. And I have a really hard time squaring that circle of what we do about this. It seems like it'll get easier and easier to make whatever kind of photos and eventually videos we want. And it's easy for me to imagine a pretty dark world where no one has any idea of what is true. And for a long time, video was our one oracle of truth, right? When things were in doubt, there's the video. We see the video. That will soon no longer be compelling evidence at all of what is true, what's not true. Where are you with misinformation and deepfakes, and where is the arrow or the kind of meter, the concern meter for you? How high is that? What do you think could be a solution for that, if any?
Yeah. Yes, concern meter very high. And yet I also think that there is nothing new about the fact that look to folks like Errol Morris and Susan Sontag having arguments about whether photographs are doctored, right? Every medium has had these kind of questions about truthfulness or representation, or what is a pure representation of truth versus an edited representation of truth. Or you look back at like photos of Stalin, or I think it was Stalin editing out disgraced members of his cabinet or whatever, right? So photography as a starting point has never been a perfect truth medium either. And so I think it's helpful to just reset the starting point of, we do have examples of this from history, and we have tools, and whether it's media literacy or evidence journalists are going to investigate or a publication is going to be careful about what they publish. And they have expectations and requirements of what any given photograph they're publishing has been vetted, right? So I think it becomes a question of practice. It becomes a question of media literacy. I think there's also this weird moment still, or that perhaps that we're in right now, where there is still an uncanniness to AI. And so there was some picture of a child on maybe what's Simon Cowell on?
Oh, I'm the wrong person to ask.
Whatever the music competition show is. And it was this child who was like quite obese and had this like crazy American flag outfit. And one of the posts I saw about it was like, was this AI generated? And it's so there's already this kind of user consumer literacy about this is a weird image. What about it feels uncanny, feels that it has a certain aesthetic. Like there is a Midjourney aesthetic, even if there's all of this ability to do this in the style of XYZ, there are still kind of artifacts and things that, for now sure.
A year or two from now, who knows? And also my concern though is, and I appreciate you're bringing a positive, constructive energy here. I'll be the person to be negative now in the sense that my concern is that yes, there will be hopefully greater literacy on people identifying, that's uncanny, that's AI. My concern is that caginess could be weaponized to make people not believe things that actually are true. So there could be a video that is absolute truth, and someone says, oh, that's basically an AI version of fake news, right? That's AI news. That's AI video. Don't believe that. And that can be a get out of jail free card to sow doubts on whether text, photo, video, again, bringing us to F it. We don't know what to believe. So that to me that's the thing that most concerns me personally above killer robots, above doomer stuff. That I have talked to many smart folks about this. I know there is work at hand about, embedding in the actual assets, having like
watermarks or
that kind of stuff. Yeah. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, but it's hard to imagine. I guess it will, to your point, eventually be on the intermediaries, whether that's a media company or even the platform of social media, to be able to like have some kind of, it's to me, I'm too cynical. I don't think the average Joe Schmuckatelli will do the work to like make sure there's the right watermark. There needs to be something embedded in the system itself to have a alarm to be very clear if it's AI, and then people trusting that system. And we're not a very trusting society right now of anything. We'll see. All right. On that cheery note, let's move on to a different to a different concern. How about you at the top, and I respect why we want to. I think when we focus too much on the Terminator style doomerism stuff, that potentially, because it's so sci-fi, might have the effects of marginalizing the more sober here and now critiques about what we already discussed of bias, of power concentration, environmental concerns, and so on. That said, let's take a moment to explore killer robot lens. Is that something that you're at all, is that on your kind of radar as something to be mindful about when we think about AI development, AI safety, or is it like so out there that it's actually a little bit of a counterproductive to be spending too much time and energy on those concerns?
I mean, as someone who also thinks sci-fi is a form of tech criticism, like it's one of the most kind of colorful and visceral ways of exploring our present concerns with technology, I think it absolutely is a valid space to explore and question to run some cycles of thought on. And especially in the sense that it leads us to kind of solutions about governance, right? I think ultimately many of the concerns we have are like, how will we know? How will we respond? How will we have humans in the loop, et cetera, to ensure that kind of takeover moment doesn't happen? And I think it is a productive means of getting at these solutions, interventions, questions faster. And back to this kind of architecture stack question is these are the things that we have to figure out early on because you're building out this kind of inevitable future based on a lot of decisions that are made today. And yeah, I think there is value in that projection of the worst case scenario fear.
I'd love to pivot in a moment to the state of criticism itself and what you want to see more or less of with how we're approaching tech and AI criticism. And maybe as a way to get there, I think it's amazing that you've been doing this long enough to have a perspective on the last decade or so, how things have evolved. I think there's a lot of folks who've just gotten this game in the last year or two. When you wrote that incredible paper, we'll link to this in the show notes, in 2016 about tech criticism, almost 10 years ago, how would you say your thoughts on criticism has evolved in the past 8 years? And then what are you maybe as the space has evolved, we've all evolved, you've evolved, I've evolved, space has evolved. What is concerning you more than back then 8 years ago? Is there anything that's concerning you a bit less than 8 years ago? Where like, actually, okay, the space has grown up in this way and I feel a little better about this issue.
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. I will go back even further because I think what inspired the work on tech criticism was a frustration of not knowing where I fit in this kind of media landscape or not having language to describe myself because I didn't identify as a journalist and I didn't like tech writer didn't suffice. And so but I was also having all this hesitation about, but criticism seems to be so fraught. And what is it about criticism and tech specifically that feels complex or feels like it has this automatic negative connotation? So prior to that, I had been writing largely about personal data and privacy and the stakes of our personal data and privacy. And for a long time, the conversation was a lot about you should care about your privacy, period. And it took a lot of convincing because often the counter argument was, it's just ads. It's not that big of a deal. And now, of course, we see where all of that data ended up.
A couple of catastrophes later.
Yes, also a couple of catastrophes later, or a couple of key whistleblower moments.
Yes.
Snowden, Cambridge Analytica, like those were key moments of really articulating what the stakes were in these uses and misuses of data. And still, so I would argue that like the window of the work that needs to be done is less about convincing people that we should care about our data or care about AI and the uses of AI. I think we have developed as a society a certain literacy with tech interfaces and tech by way of social media, frankly, to understand TikTok having a For You page has given us a sense of literacy about what personalization means and what algorithms do. And so less of the work is about explaining that and about describing the fact that is even happening.
Great.
And now the work is really to say, is it designed the way we want it to be designed? Now that we have the understanding of what technology is actually doing, are we okay with the decisions that have been made by titans of industry about how this is supposed to work? And what agency do I have as a consumer, as a user, a constituent to influence that or push back on that? And so I think a lot of the work now is about helping people imagine alternative futures that, for example, we haven't demanded that Instagram give you the ability to tweak the algorithmic feed. We could demand that. We could say...
That's a really good point. That's so straightforward, actually. Yeah.
Right? And it would take a consumer movement to get to the point where they say, let's have more news. Like me as a user, I want to tweak my algorithm on a weekly or monthly basis, or show me less of whatever content. And we just don't have that ability because we haven't demanded it. And so I think it's just such a micro example, but we're also beginning to talk about regulating technology from a kind of youth protection perspective. And I think that is an area that has seen the most movement from a like regulatory perspective, because we can get around the fact that, or we can agree on the fact that like the role of government is to protect vulnerable underaged consumers, because they're not consumers, they are children.
That's a pretty hard one to line up against. So a rare issue that both sides of the aisle are for. As we start to wind down, let's circle back to one thing we started with, the idea that criticism does not therefore mean negativity. And it's actually, I love how you reference in the 2016 paper the concept that literary critics don't hate literature. They want to think deeply about literature and appreciate it and find ways for it to be better. So with that, through that lens, how would you characterize the current state of tech criticism? And how would you, if you can wave a magic wand, how would you change it? What do you want to see more of or less of?
Yeah, going back to that feeling of love is ultimately, I am inspired because I love technology, right? Like I grew up on AOL. I like think there's so many amazing things that the internet has given us. And I think it's really comes back to that question about imagining alternatives or imagining ways of whose interests are being represented, whose values are being embedded in the design and the kind of creation of these tools, and how much do we as citizens, consumers, users have any choice in that ecosystem. And so I think that's really the role of criticism currently. But so I think going back, I love this quote from Neil Postman. He argues, and he's one of those original like 1950s critics of television. And so he talks about being a loving resistance fighter. The resistance fighter understands that technology must never be accepted as part of the natural order of things, and that every technology, from IQ tests to automobiles to television sets to computers, is a product of particular economic and political context and carries with it a program, an agenda, and a philosophy that may or may not be life-enhancing, and that therefore requires scrutiny, criticism, and control. And so ultimately, it's this idea that none of this is inevitable. Right? AI is not inevitable.
Yeah.
Or the way that AI exists is not inevitable. And so I think we are always in this position to question, examine, explore, and pose alternatives.
To that point, what advice do you have for listeners of how to be more critical of questions to ask, of how to interrogate their own thoughts on AI and use of AI in their lives? What should we all be doing more of and thinking more about?
I would love to see more people talking about what it is like to live with AI, to be in kind of community with AI. I think we're not asking enough questions about who it's actually serving. I think we could be asking a lot of more questions about what it is actually good for and what are we optimizing for. That core question, I think, really should be behind every single conversation about AI, whether or not it's in an organization or it's, should I be using this for my email? Should I be using it? Should I turn it on in my search?
So to make that to connect the dots a little bit, I'm guessing you have thought deeply about these questions. So what are you concerned that perhaps all too often AI is being optimized for X, when instead perhaps we should think more about optimizing it for Y?
Yeah, I think a lot of the motivations behind most conversations I've overheard in kind of enterprise applications is about cost savings and about margins. And I think there's a case to be made that, yes, automate as much as we possibly can. And that has been true of industry forever and ever, right? This is arguably a similar continuation of the way that industrial processes have developed. But I love the critiques that are saying, like, I don't want AI to be painting a picture. Like, I want it to free up my time so that I can be the one to paint the picture. And I think that gets to the core argument about human creativity and expansiveness, and these arguments that, like, I think Ted Chiang had a great article about AI will never be an artist, because that's just inherently the novelty of what art is. Fundamentally is not how AI, at least large language models, are built. They're good at replicating, but they're not good at novelty. And yeah, I'm hopeful on that front.
Last couple of quick questions for you. You on your website describe yourself as a radical futurist, if I'm getting it right. Say a bit more about what that means and what you're excited about or terrified of, or some combination thereof, as a radical futurist.
Sure. I think a lot about what comes after capitalism. So I guess that's a good place to start. I also identify a little bit as a Cassandra of Greek myth, who is the prophetess warning that Troy will fall and nobody's listening. For a long time, it felt like I was screaming into the void talking about data privacy. And so I think there is something radical about imagining this hegemonic system that we, like, all take for granted potentially being disrupted. And I think part of what being a radical futurist looks like for me is not taking anything for granted, and also trying to think about systems that increase justice and being, and don't necessarily involve unbridled growth. And I think that's it's a hard position to take when there are forces, especially in
market
tech.
Forces are all the other direction, right?
Yeah. And also that the ideology I look to, for example, the Techno-Optimist manifesto that Andreessen Horowitz published a few years ago, basically said that critics and ethicists were the enemy of progress and growth. And I think there's a way for criticism, for skepticism, for questioning assumptions, for that to be productive, even if it's not capital invested productive. And
Absolutely.
I think that's so important. It's not always easy. So
Socrates saw himself purportedly as the gadfly, to be asking these tough questions, to be annoying, so that we are thinking more deeply. That, in my book, is progress. That is moving us forward, is to be asking these tough questions. Asking tough questions does not mean that we don't want progress. And if progress can't handle tough questions, then it's not that resilient and tough after all.
Well, and it gets back to a question of progress for whom, and by what definition are you defining? Yeah. Are you describing progress? And I think that's also where the challenge for me has always, the tension in technology criticism. Technology is fundamentally tied to progress. And so there is this inherent understanding that to be critiquing technology is to be anti-progressive, truly in the like Luddite sense of the word. But when we go back to the Luddites, it wasn't that they were against technology. They were against a system that was eliminating their jobs and their livelihoods without a social net or a support net to respond to that systemic social change, right? What they were protesting was the fact that they were being eliminated, not that there was a loom. And so I think we quickly lose sight of the reality that, tech and society, it's so easy to just isolate the technology when we're always talking about tech and society together, and tech and people. Tech is inherently human in the sense that we are the ones creating it and building it and using it.
And impacted by it. That's a great point. Last question for you. I ask of all my guests, how are you or are you not using AI in your own life, whether for work or for fun?
Sure. I'll fully admit I used it. I was curious to see how ChatGPT would summarize the critiques of AI. And honestly, it did a pretty good job. Not bad. It was more a kind of thought experiment. And in part, I've said this about data as well, is that in order to critique, you have to be exposed. And so for a long time, when I was doing a lot with privacy and personal data, people would be like, but you're so online. Like, why are you so online? It's like, because I need to know what it is like to be online, and I don't block my ads and et cetera. So I think that applies in parallel to AI. One of the strangest possible uses I've been exploring is inputting the results of a tarot spread to see how ChatGPT would interpret like past, present, future. Here's the card. It's the Ace of Cups. It's the Hierophant. It's the Hermit. What's the interpretation? And it's really interesting because, again, these are things that are somewhat universal. Like, there are specific understandings of what any of these symbols are supposed to mean. But then there's also something very intuitive and personal about tarot and using it as a mirror for accessing your own intuition. And so even just seeing, okay, what's the generic interpretation? How does that make me feel? How do I respond to that? Is a really interesting exercise. So
fortune tellers,
one of the weirder.
One more profession at risk by AI. I hadn't thought of that from a job front. Sara, thank you so much for helping myself and listeners think more clearly and deeply about these issues. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for all the work you do. I think it's important for the space. I fully agree with you that these questions are important, are not nihilistic, are not negative, and is part of progress. And we need to think deeply about progress for whom. Thank you again so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
And there you have it. Thanks again to Sara Watson, Technology Critic, and thank you to you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, this episode of AI Curious. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, rate it 5 stars, comment, send to a friend. If you're on YouTube, please leave a comment. Do you agree with these critiques? What other concerns do you have? What concerns do you have we have not covered? What most concerns you? What makes you stay up at night saying, oh my God, because of AI, we are effed in this capacity? Let me know. I want to hear. Thanks again and see you next time.